I am going to ask each of our panelists to do a brief introduction, and then we are going to dive into questions that really sort of speak to the title of the session with some details sprinkled in. So let's start first with Dr. Pack.
Hi, good morning. I'm Rob Pack, Executive Vice Provost at East Tennessee State University and Director of the Addiction Science Center at ETSU, as well as co-director of something that we call the Opioids Research Consortium of Central Appalachia. And we have within that our first thematic research network, which is focused on peer recovery support specialists, called STARS, Studies to Advance Recovery Science. So that's one of the NIDA R24s focused on recovery, and we do that in partnership with Virginia Tech.
Excellent. Let's go to Dr. Timko.
Hi, first, I'm really happy to be here today. Thanks for having me. I am a senior research career scientist in health services research in the Department of Veterans Affairs and a clinical professor in the Department of Psychiatry at Stanford.
Excellent. And Dr. Tucker.
Good morning. I've already learned so much just in the short time we've been in this session and look forward to our discussion. I am professor in the Department of Health Education and Behavior at the University of Florida, and I also am the director of the Center for Behavioral Economic Health Research.
Thank you. So as Dr. B said this morning, today is, I think, a little bit more casual. I'm going to ask each of the participants to take their time in answering the question. We don't want folks to feel rushed. We can always do some follow-ups, but really just want you to contribute. We'll have a conversation. We'll be watching the chat. We'll do that for the first few minutes, and then toward the end, we will take questions from Mimi, who has been taking them from the group. So this panel, I think we are really doing some foundation setting, making sure that we are all using the same terms and words and definitions and kind of laying that baseline. Peter also this morning, talked us through some of what we heard yesterday around the different definitions of recovery. He talked about recovery capital. And I think one of the things that we're going to do is hear how individuals and communities can help individuals really sort of build recovery capital. What are those supports? What are the systems? And each of you has certainly a particular expertise and an angle through which you've looked at those things. So we are going to talk about things like, and if I'm looking at the agenda, natural recovery, mutual help groups, interventions in long-term recovery, role of recovery supports, recovery intentions, and technology. And that's a nice follow-up to what Yuri talked about. So first of all, natural recovery. This term came up yesterday, came up again today. Can you first just talk a little bit about what each of you, how each of you sort of define that and think about that, and how that is important or plays a role in the work that you do?
You want me to start? Because this is my
Sure.
main research area.
Excellent, Dr. Tucker.
This is an area I got into in the middle of the 80s. And the reason I did that was because at that point in time, we were in an environment, a research environment that was, I would call the clinical treatment horse race era, where everybody was trying to show that this treatment was better than that treatment, and it was better than this treatment, and so on. And of course, they weren't finding that there were important differences. And then we have Project Match, which just really put the stamp on that in a multi-site clinical trial. And I read an article by a British researcher, Betsy Tom, who started talking about help seeking and the importance of separating out treatment and treatment outcomes from determinants of who will seek help, and of course the majority who will not seek help. And that immediately led to the issue of, okay, there are a lot of people out there in the population that recover on their own. And the very early term for that was spontaneous remission. That goes back to Hans Eysenck's psychotherapy studies back in the 50s. We have abandoned that term in favor of natural recovery or self-change because there's nothing spontaneous about it. And it draws attention to trying to understand the recovery process as a longitudinal process, which I think everyone at this point realizes that's the level we should be looking at it. But you have to understand it in the natural environment. You have to understand it in context. And so for me, the big issue that I think we're going to hear a lot about from others in this panel is how do we go about characterizing the relevant dimensions of the natural environment? And I'm going to stop because I know this is kind of a segue for Dr. Pack's work.
Yeah, thank you, Jaylee, so much. I appreciate that, and I'm learning so much too. And I really appreciate the all the great content here. What we're really focused on is, you know, those parts and pieces of the recovery ecosystem, and how do we stand them up? How do we make engagement with them easy and client focused? And you know, those who are seeking the services, how do we make it so that they can access them freely and easily, and then that they're there actually for their own support? They're not competitive with one another. And if I could diverge a bit from the main topic, the main question, you know, within that ecosystem, both the ecology of what's happening in the ecosystem, but also the economy of what's happening in the ecosystem, which is a concept that I'm totally ripping off from a colleague in Roanoke named Niles Comer. So I want to give him credit for that. But don't talk about what you're going to do without also talking about how it's going to be sustained over time with resources through partnerships, with revenue generating recovery opportunities, as well as cost center type recovery opportunities. So
Dr. Pack,
that's what we're focused on.
You called that the economy of the ecosystem?
Well, I basically tried to characterize the ecosystem sort of both with what happens, right, the ecology of what's going on, but also how it's financed, how it's paid for, right, how it's sustained as well, right, because there's a whole lot of, there's a lot of challenges in this space. If you think about prevention funding, for example, you know, prevention funding is prioritized in Washington and then goes through state capitals, and then it trickles down into communities, but it does so a generation later, and then the priorities of the local community aren't what were prioritized in Washington, right? And so how do we make this local ecosystem set of partnerships sustained over time through MOUs, literal fiscal partnerships between clinics, Suboxone clinics, OBOTs and OTPs, for example. We have this model with our OTP. We co-own it with our hospital system, and the net revenue from that will be reinvested back into the Addiction Science Center over time, right? Once we pay off our debt, but we had to stand it up in this way, right? And so there's a lot to unpack here. So I will go ahead and yield the floor because I'm afraid I took us way off target, but that's really what we do.
Yeah, so I can chime in here. I come at this almost from an opposite perspective in terms of being very person level focused as opposed to system focused in a way. But I would summarize, if I'm getting to the original question, I would summarize our research that I've been involved in, and we've had some very long-term studies of 16, 20 years following people longitudinally, where the bottom line, to summarize, is actually, although natural recovery happens a lot, It speeds the recovery process along, or is more successful, so to speak, if people get help than when they don't get help. And, help being treatment, but also there are many other sources of help, mutual help groups, mutual 12-step alternatives. And often people go to, this is not evidence-based, but often people go to their religious helper or their family member. Or so there are a lot of ways to get help. Help is better than not getting help in terms of achieving recovery more quickly, solidly. And we do have evidence-based practices where we link people who need help to help. Most often that's been done for getting people to 12-step groups. It's also being done to get people from primary care to any kind of specialty substance use care they might need. And the emphasis is really to give people a choice of what kind of care they want to get. What do they think is a good match for them in terms of their needs and wants? For example, in the VA, things have changed a lot. People used to not want residential treatment. Now there's a very high demand for residential treatment, and we actually don't have enough beds, as was mentioned, to provide all of that treatment. And we really need to work on filling that gap between people saying they want help and then actually getting them to the care they need. So we're trying to keep in touch with people, continue to kind of, it's not a treatment, but continue to link with those people in between that gap of when they get identified as needing care and when they can actually get care. That's a really important piece. And I know I'm going on too long, but I think just to say one more thing, ideally, recovery would start wherever people are. So in schools, we would link them up to care from schools. From colleges, there's a lot of great work being done with collegiate recovery programs. If they're seeking housing support, if they're seeking employment support, we know the most, I think, about how to link people to care when they're already getting some kind of medical treatment. But that needs to be extended to all these, in an ideal world, all these different settings. And we know also, I'll say the last thing, that patients who are getting medical care are very open on the whole, contrary maybe to popular opinion or understanding. They are very open to discussing their substance use during a medical care episode, and see that as helpful. They like being listened to, they like being understood. It's a matter of really the medical providers being able to have the time and the connection to those patients to really have those conversations happen and lead to something good. So that was a lot of run-on sentences, and I'll just stop.
That was excellent. That was excellent. You all hit on, I think, a lot of the things that we wanted to talk about in this session. A few things that I heard. One is what works for one person is going to be different than what works for another person. And it's important that that individual be able to choose. So to support natural recovery with things like support groups and the other kinds of sort of interventions and supports that we have, it feels like in some ways that runs a little bit counter to how we think about research and science. And that is usually sort of a very much the intervention looks like this, and it needs to have these pieces in it. And we go out and we prove that that sort of works and it has those pieces. How do you sort of think about that and reconcile that when it really feels like the best recovery for folks is like a snowflake, and my snowflake is very different than your snowflake. It's, you know, how do we sort of reconcile that the research that we're trying to do and to prove best practices, you know, comes from this basis of, again, kind of the, you know, the study of interventions that seem to be, you know, very sort of rigid.
Can I pick up on that?
Yes, ma'am.
There are a lot of issues embedded in this, and I think that it is fair to say that the treatment outcome evaluation agenda has been the dominant agenda by NIDA, by NIAAA. The whole push for evidence-based practice has led to manualized treatments and high fidelity interventions and so on and so forth. And I think we have gotten to the point now that we understand what good treatment looks like, but we also know that all of the sort of internal variations in different treatments really don't make that much difference as long as it's professionally delivered. And one of the things that's missing here is the consumer perspective. And I think this is something that, you know, we learned from the harm reduction movement back in the 90s over in European countries, where they actually had dialogue with people like in the Netherlands that they characterized as junkies, because they wanted them to have input into what they needed and what kind of services would benefit them. And we in our research have keyed off on that, and we have done some consumer surveys where we have asked people in different age groups, what kind of services do you want? And it's not typically traditional addiction treatment. And they also want more of a spectrum of care that spans from minimal lower threshold interventions that they can use on their own, like guided self-change interventions, things that they can access on the internet through the use of technology, before they ever were willing to cross that clinical threshold for care. And again, I think that people know this in the field. I think there's research being done now on trying to flesh out, if you will, that continuum of care so that we can provide this range of services for people. But we still have a lot of work to do there, and technology is an important tool, especially for the younger generation.
Thank you. Dr. Pack, I saw some nodding.
Oh yeah, there's a lot to unpack there. And so sort of a public health innovator named Larry Green, and Dr. Green talks a lot and sort of driving the concept of dissemination and implementation science, talks a lot about, instead of evidence-based practice, we need more practice-based evidence. I'm confident many of you have heard that before. Practice-based evidence is getting into the clinics and community and the networks and asking folks what they actually need, and then figuring out how to use some of these modern research tools to tackle these questions, right? We don't necessarily have to treat everything like an RCT anymore. We've got all kinds of pragmatic tools, if you will, for all kinds of study designs where we can roll out things in communities in a stepwise design, or interrupted time series design, if we're doing the right kind of assessment of the outcomes, right? And also can set that up in enough places so that we have consistent outcomes between sites. And I know Dr. Timko and Dr. Timko and Tucker have plenty of experience with this, and they can probably also weigh in here. There's a lot of challenges to doing that, including, how do you get partners in clinics? For example, we're trying to set up a kind of a practice-based research network with addiction medicine clinics, like an addictions PBRN. And this is a harder thing to do than you might expect to actually conduct research in those settings. But I want to go ahead and yield the floor to my colleagues here and see if they have any additional thoughts.
Yeah, I just want to, as far as the question of, kind of manualized interventions and sticking to adhering to them exactly or not, I just want to mention that, for example, there are a number of evidence-based 12-step facilitation practices, and they're all effective. And I think the point is they have common elements. They prepare people for 12-step. They link people to other 12-step group members. They kind of serve as a champion for 12-step groups. So, just extending it a little bit more, there's a lot of commonality between kind of the active ingredients of 12-step groups or mutual help groups more generally and treatment settings. You know, they provide bonding with someone, some goal direction, some structure. They help build self-efficacy and coping skills. So I think getting to your question, that across a lot of different kinds of interventions or help resources, they're really doing very common things to help people on the road to recovery. So I think we know a little bit less, speaking of technology, about how that is going to work as far as mobilizing those kinds of mechanisms. I'm not sure we know as much yet, but I'm sure we will soon, given the changes in care over the pandemic.
Yeah, since a couple of you mentioned technology, we definitely said we would hit on that in this session. Let's go ahead and dip our toes in, understanding that there's much, much more to learn. If we were to just start by sort of summarizing the opportunities and challenges, what do you feel at this point are sort of the biggest opportunities and then the biggest challenges that we have to overcome in terms of the use of technology?
Again, I'll start because I've done some work on this and I'm doing some work on this right now. One of the things that I think researchers really have to be wary of is not to get seduced by the most current technology. You know, you don't have to do this with the best iPhone that just came out. And I learned this lesson when I was in Alabama for almost 25 years, and that's a very poor state. But at this point, everybody has a telephone and most everybody has a cell phone. And so if you want to use technology but keep it accessible, you want to pick a form of technology that people can get access to. And so I am big on phone-based interventions that can be disseminated. And we are doing a project now at the University of Florida where we are focusing on emerging adults, 18 to 28 years old, because I think that is a developmental cohort where you can make changes that have impact over the entire lifespan. You know, that's a period of time where people either age out or mature out or whatever you want to call it of a substance using lifestyle, or they don't. And then by the time they're 40, they need intensive treatment and they have to enter what we consider to be sort of the classic recovery process that is often going to take years. So that's a group that I'm very interested in from an early intervention standpoint. And what we're using is a peer-to-peer recruitment method that is phone-based, and it's called respondent-driven sampling. We've adapted it to a phone platform. And so what we're doing is you recruit folks that meet your target criteria who are risky, heavy drinkers who live in the community. You know, these are not people that are going to come to your treatment or intervention program. You go out, you find them, and that's really the nature of public health. You know, you go to people, you're opportunistic. You recruit them, train them how to recruit their peers, push the intervention out through a link to a website that they can access on the telephone. And we have just started this. I'll let you know at some point whether it works well. But this is a way potentially to infiltrate the social networks of people that have harmful substance use and related problems without them having to become an identified patient.
That's fantastic and it's super interesting. I can't wait to read the paper on this one. And also, if you ever want to partner in Appalachia, just let me know for a multi-site. But anyway, fantastic point. You know, these in-health interventions, and I saw in the chat, Dr. Ashford put in comment about recovery, digital recovery services platforms. I think those are fantastic. I want to talk just briefly, if I may, about, you know, and it's just an idea still, but what if we could take existing data and electronic platforms out of pharmacies and roll a group of pharmacies and maybe a pilot to think through how to re-engage people with their Suboxone. Okay, so this one's really complex because people have a hard time getting Suboxone in our region, at least, from certain pharmacies, because they are trying to, you know, they don't want those people in their clinics or in their pharmacies or whatever. And it's just infuriating. But what if we had a progressive group of community pharmacies, for example, and they wanted to actually try to help people with adherence, and when they saw people dropping off, they started to chase after them and help out on the adherence side and the retention into treatment side from that perspective. I mean, let's think about the existing electronic systems without reinventing or you know, inventing brand new ones all the time.
Dr. Timko?
Yeah, so on the topic of technology, I would say, again, what we learn in the VA is patient choice is very important. So what do patients prefer? And we try to provide that. Do they want to do it by have their treatment by phone, by video, in person, some kind of mix of that if the treatment extends over time? We find that so choice, again, a menu and what works for the patient. And then often patients really like the kind of anonymity that's provided over the phone. They feel like they can kind of open up more over the phone without being seen. Some people say that. And just kind of jumping a little bit to the issue of technology, and maybe it'll be covered more in the next panel. Since the pandemic started, of course, many mutual help groups switched to an only online platform. So there has been some research done on that. John Kelly's group at Harvard has done some of that work. And Sarah Zemore is in the next panel. And the bottom line is that it looks like online participation is successful in helping people through their recovery, especially maybe early recovery, interestingly enough. And the last thing I'll say on this is when it comes to technology for our patient population or for people trying to get access to it, we find it important to help people use the technology. First of all, like they don't know how to, how to get on a video chat or open an app, download an app, get on an app. So that's just another little piece that needs to be attended to, just like we try to help people get to the next healthcare source that they need. We're going to need to help people actually use the technology first to be able to get the help offered through the technology.
Thank you. That's excellent. And I feel like we've done a good job here of laying some groundwork for continued conversations in the additional panels for today in regard to technology. Dr. Timko, you actually hit on a couple of things that go to my next question. So in thinking about since the beginning of the pandemic, right, we have had a lot of folks struggle who were in long-term recovery because they lost some of those in-person supports, things that really sort of worked for them, right? I think you know, thinking about stages of change, and I appreciate Peter again this morning talked about stages of change. I'm going to kind of take us back to the beginning of the continuum and would love to hear from you all about this concept of recovery intention and what that really means. I think yesterday we also heard the term pre-recovery. I'm maybe drawing some connections. I'm not sure if they're there, but recovery intention and how specifically researchers need to learn more about what that looks like. How do we facilitate that? How does public health facilitate that? How do we build that intention so that we're enabling people to move to those next stages? Not sure who wants to start.
Yeah, well, I mean, I have
Perfect.
to say, I think we had some little email exchanges about this in getting ready for this panel. I'm not really that familiar with the term recovery intention. I looked it up a little bit. I mean, there are the kinds of intentions that you see in kind of popular culture. You know, I intend to, you know, have a great day today, or there's that, and then I'm very familiar in my training in social psychology is there are attitude, intention, behavior studies. I don't think that's probably what you're talking about. And so I thought maybe it was kind of motives or reasons for entering recovery in the first place. And there was a lot of research done on that back around the time of spontaneous recovery, where people were studying why are people seeking help at this point and how much of a difference does that make for them. And I think it kind of dropped out of the field. And I think because we know that when people are seeking help, there's an accumulation of troubles that they're having medical problems, family problems, employment problems. So we know that, so that I'm not sure that specific reasons for seeking substance use at this time are really the critical factor in treatment planning or in, you know, helping that person get connected to the right kind of care. So I'll just kind of leave it there.
Dr. Pack, and then we'll go to Dr. Tucker.
Yeah, so I thought John Kelly yesterday, you know, in his framing of the continuum against the stages of change model, you know, and really looking at this at the space between pre-contemplation and contemplation, I thought that was actually sort of where this might land, and you know what are to blend in other sort of health behavior theories here related to cues to action, and then also setting up the environment. But then, you know, for things like opioid use disorder or things that might have particularly acute withdrawal, like alcohol, benzos, et cetera, you know, the medical supports around, you know, when someone does begin to have acute withdrawal symptoms, and you know, and so education and I think in many ways is going to help people understand what's going to happen and where to access things, but we need to put those services almost in their way, right? And make it easy to access such services, and it's really quite difficult at this time.
Dr. Tucker.
Yeah, well, I was part of the email exchange yesterday, and I was like, I don't know what recovery intentions are, because that is not a term that is used in the scientific literature. And part of it goes back to Christine's comment about the social psychology research in the last century that was heavily trying to establish that attitudes and intentions were somehow going to predict behavior, and it never did. And so that line of research really kind of got abandoned. Maybe perhaps it's reframed into the concept of motivation for treatment or motivation for change. But in all fairness, I have to say that, again, from the scientific literature, the trans-theoretical model or stages of change has been discredited to the point that Robert West, who was the editor of Addiction, said that we have to have a moratorium on this theory. And this, you know, this was 20 years ago. So I just put that out there because I think that The risk of talking about recovery intentions is it lends itself to a circular reification that puts the responsibility on the person. And so if they fail in their recovery, it's because their recovery intentions were not high enough. And Peter earlier this morning talked about that and talked about how you can always, in a treatment program, blame the failure of the treatment on the person because they didn't have strong enough intentions. So where I land on this, I come back to, we have to characterize the circumstances that surround people that serve as incentives for seeking care or serve as barriers to treatment. And if we understand what is going on in their family situation, their job situation, their social network, their natural environments, that I think is a more productive way to talk about what will incentivize them to seek help and what will be a barrier.